There is something nobody tells you about being the person everyone relies on. Nobody warns you that it was never actually a flaw. It was a prediction, a correct reading of the room, a survival strategy that worked so well you kept using it long after you realized it was working. That is not weakness. That is pattern recognition operating at a level most people never develop. You saw threats. You adapted. The system punished honesty and rewarded accommodation, and you learned to navigate that system while others crashed into it headfirst, wondering why nobody liked them either. But here is where the narrative breaks. The self-help industry wants to tell you that your people-pleasing was learned helplessness, that you picked up some wounded belief from childhood, and now you need to unlearn it. What they do not say is that you might have been right, that the environment you were in might have actually been dangerous, that saying no to a volatile person, saying no to someone who uses rejection as a weapon, saying no to a person who has already made it clear that boundaries equal abandonment, might genuinely end in the abandonment you feared. When you start setting boundaries with someone who built their entire relationship with you on your flexibility, you are not liberating yourself. You are breaking an agreement nobody signed, but both of you understood. They do not get angry because they are wounded or immature. They get angry because you changed the terms of something they were relying on. That does not make them evil. It makes them surprised and hurt, and yes, sometimes vengeful, because human beings do not respond well to the sudden removal of something they had built their sense of security around. Here is what the people pleaser knows that others do not. Honor is a privilege. It is something you can only afford when you have safety, financial independence, alternative relationships to fall back on, and a nervous system regulated enough to handle rejection. If you do not have those things, if you are still dependent on people who will withdraw love when you disappoint them, if your survival is still tied to someone else's approval, then your people-pleasing is not a character flaw. It is a life raft. And the person who tells you to get off the raft while you are still in open water is not liberating you. But let's say you do have the safety. Let's say you do have the resources and the independent life and the alternative relationships. You stop people-pleasing. You set boundaries. You say no. You speak honestly. And then something happens that nobody prepared you for. You get exactly what you wanted, and it feels like loss. Because it is. The version of yourself that everyone loved disappears. The person you were for them is gone. Some of them will grieve that person. Some of them will be relieved. Some of them will cycle through anger at you for taking something away from them, even if what you took was the constant availability of your own self-sacrifice. And you, standing on the other side of that boundary, you get to experience something that the boundary-setting advocates rarely mention. You get to be alone with yourself in a way you have never been before. And that person, without the organizing principle of taking care of others, without the narrative of self-sacrifice, without the clear role to play, that person is sometimes a stranger. Some people discover an authentic self on the other side of the accommodation. Others discover an emptiness. Others discover that their sense of identity was so wrapped up in being needed that without that function, they do not actually know who they are. The self-help narrative does not account for this. It assumes that underneath every people-pleaser is a vibrant, authentic individual just waiting to be liberated. Sometimes that is true. Sometimes there is mostly fear and habit and the person-shaped space that other people's expectations carved out. There is also something that nobody says about the relationships that end. When you stop accommodating someone, when you stop being the person they built their life around, some of those relationships will not survive. That is true. It is also true that some of those relationships were not actually relationships. They were transactions. But here is what makes it more complicated. Some of those transactions were genuine and mutual. The partner who appreciated your flexibility and gave you stability in return. The parent who relied on your emotional support and gave you a sense of purpose. The friend who took and somehow you did not mind because being needed felt like being loved. When those end, you do not just lose the other person. You lose the ecosystem that defined you. The reason people stay in these patterns is not always because they are afraid or broken or lack confidence. Sometimes it is because the arrangement, however unequal it looks from the outside, actually works for both people. You get to feel essential. They get to feel taken care of. You get to avoid the terror of disappointing someone. They get to avoid having to adjust or change. It is stable. It is predictable. And yes, it costs you something. But stability and predictability cost everyone something. The question is not whether the cost is justified. The question is whether the other options cost more. This is where the narrative usually ends with the previous version. But there is a third path that neither script has examined. What if you did not need to choose between self-sacrifice and authentic self-expression? What if you do not need to swing from people-pleaser to boundary setter like a pendulum? What if the actual maturity is much stranger and more difficult than either extreme? It is the ability to be strategic and honest at the same time. To understand that with some people, some relationships, some contexts, accommodation is the actual right choice. Not because you are broken, but because you have assessed the situation and decided that the cost-benefit ratio makes sense. And with other people and other situations, it is not. The skill is in the discernment, not in the wholesale rejection of people-pleasing as if it were purely a symptom of dysfunction. Because here is something that genuinely unsettles people about the chronic accommodator who develops this skill. Once you understand that your flexibility was a form of intelligence and not a form of weakness, once you can deploy it strategically instead of reflexively, you become more powerful than the person who simply says no all the time. The person who will not accommodate anything is limited, but the person who can read the room, who can adapt when it serves them, who can hold firm when it matters, who can disappoint someone while still maintaining the relationship, who can say yes in a way that creates obligation and say no in a way that creates respect, that person is operating at a level most never reach. The problem with the current narrative is that it treats people-pleasing as something to cure rather than something to master. As if the goal is to become someone who does not feel the impulse to accommodate, rather than someone who feels the impulse and decides consciously whether to act on it. The former is just trading one compulsion for another. The latter is actual freedom. But this requires something the self-help world is not comfortable admitting. It requires that you become willing to harm people sometimes. That you become willing to be seen as the villain in their story. That you accept that some people will not understand or forgive you. Not because you were wrong, but because understanding would require them to change their perception of you. And change is more threatening than anger. They would rather hate you for having boundaries than adjust their expectations to accommodate your autonomy. So you have to be willing to be hated. You have to be willing to be misunderstood. You have to be willing to sacrifice the approval of people whose approval you spent your entire life collecting. That is not heroic. That is not growth. That is not freedom in any sense that feels good. It is just a different kind of cost. And the cost might be higher than the cost of continuing to accommodate, depending on how many relationships are built on your compliance and how much of your identity is still tied to being needed. This is why the transition is so difficult for people. It is not because they are weak or broken. It is because they are being asked to make a genuine trade-off and nobody is being honest about what they are losing. They are not just losing approval. They are losing a coherent sense of self. They are losing relationships that, however unequal, were genuinely sustaining. They are losing the narrative that made their suffering meaningful. You accommodate because it makes you valuable. When you stop, you have to find a new reason to believe you have value. So here is what actually happens when people-pleasers stop people-pleasing. Some of them become healthier and happier. Some of them become lonelier and more anxious. Some of them trade one form of suffering for another and call it growth because growth has better marketing. Some of them realize that their people-pleasing was not pathology but adaptation to a genuinely difficult environment, and the actual healing is not to stop accommodating, but to leave the environment. And some of them discover that they were accommodating the wrong people, and that there are people in the world who can receive their generosity without exploiting it, and who will actually value them more for having boundaries. But the one thing that is true across all of these outcomes is that nothing gets resolved by simply deciding to be different. The script that was written into your nervous system does not delete because you read about boundaries on the internet. The people who built their lives around your flexibility do not stop expecting it because you had a realization. And the part of you that finds being needed to be one of the deepest forms of human meaning does not disappear because you intellectually understand that you are worthy without being useful. Actual change in this area is slower and more complicated and less satisfying than any narrative wants to admit. It is years of micro-decisions. It is learning to tolerate the guilt that comes with disappointing someone, which is different from eliminating the guilt. It is maintaining relationships with people who resent your boundaries while also not abandoning yourself to keep them happy. It is mourning the loss of the identity that people-pleasing gave you, even as you reject the terms of that identity. It is discovering that saying no does not actually feel as liberating as you thought it would, because it turns out you like being needed, and now you are just lonely and boundaried. This is not the message that sells. This is not the story that builds followers or creates the sense that you have figured something out. But it is the honest one. The person who successfully navigates this terrain is not someone who learned to say no. They are someone who learned to say yes and no from a place of genuine choice rather than compulsion. And that choice only becomes available when you stop treating people-pleasing as a character flaw and start treating it as a superpower that got turned against you. Once you make that shift, you can actually decide when to use it and when not to. Before that shift, you are just swinging between two different forms of helplessness.